By the time I reached the creek, the bridge was already on the ground. Not damaged. Gone. The planks were split, the rails were smashed, and the crossing my family had maintained for years looked like somebody had taken a machine to it just to prove they could. Fresh tire tracks cut through the mud. Broken bolts lay in the grass. And on the other side, standing with her hands on her hips like she had just cleaned up a neighborhood problem, was Melissa Hart. She told me the HOA had removed an unsafe structure. She said the bridge was unauthorized. She said the community had every right to protect its entrance from private decisions that affected everyone. I looked past her at the ruined crossing. Then I looked farther up the road, where the only paved route into the neighborhood disappeared behind the trees and curved straight back toward the land title she had clearly never bothered to read. That was when I understood how bad her mistake really was. She thought she had torn down one old bridge. She had no idea she had just touched the only road holding her whole neighborhood together. And the worst part for her was simple. I wasn't the one trapped on the wrong side of it. My name is Wade Mercer, and the reason I did not lose my mind when I saw that bridge in pieces was simple. I already knew Melissa Hart had been building toward something. People like her never jump straight to destruction. They start with language. Little comments that sound harmless if you do not know what they are really testing. She had been circling that crossing for months. First it was safety concerns. Then it was community liability. Then it became questions about whether a private landowner should really control infrastructure that so many residents used every day. Used. That was always the word she leaned on. Not owned. Not maintained. Not recorded. Used. And that one word told me exactly how she thought. If enough people crossed something, she started acting like it belonged to them. If enough residents depended on something, she started acting like the HOA could speak for it. If a thing was important to the neighborhood, she assumed the neighborhood's comfort mattered more than the actual deed under it. That was Melissa's whole disease. The bridge sat over a narrow creek cut where the old ranch road crossed into the developed side of the valley. My grandfather rebuilt it once after a flood. My father reinforced the supports 20 years later. I replaced the railing myself after a storm took part of it loose one winter. It was never some decorative little structure the HOA could classify as a visual nuisance and tear out between coffee and lunch. It was a working crossing tied to a road parcel my family had owned long before the subdivision put up its stone sign and started calling itself a community. Melissa knew the neighborhood used it. She also knew that was exactly why she wanted control of it. The more people relied on that road, the more she convinced herself reliance was the same thing as authority. She talked about collective access. She talked about community stewardship. Once, at an HOA meeting, she even described the crossing as shared infrastructure. Which was a beautiful phrase if your goal was to make theft sound cooperative. I asked her then what recorded document made it shared. She never answered. Now, standing at the creek with splintered boards in the mud and fresh machine tracks carved into the bank, I could see the full shape of her thinking at last. She had not torn down that bridge because it was unsafe. She tore it down because she thought long use had finally become ownership. And that is the kind of mistake only a very confident person makes right before the paperwork ruins them. Melissa was not alone when she tore the bridge down. That mattered. Not because she needed help swinging tools. She was never going to dirty her own hands if she could put a board contractor, maintenance crew, or hired machine between herself and the consequences. It mattered because people like Melissa always want witnesses when they think power is on their side. Witnesses turn bad judgment into performance. They make cruelty feel official. There were two men from a local site crew standing near the torn railing when I got there. One of them kept looking at the creek instead of at me. The other had that tight, uncomfortable posture men get when they already know the morning has gone farther than it should have. But they are still hoping the woman who gave the order will somehow talk it back into sounding reasonable. Melissa saw me looking at them and immediately started talking. She said the structure had been removed after repeated warnings. She said engineers had concerns. She said the board could not keep allowing residents to cross an unsafe bridge just because I was too stubborn to cooperate with modernization. Modernization. That was the word she chose while my family's bridge lay broken in the mud. I asked her to show me the warning. Not the memory of it. Not the board's feelings about it. The warning. She said it had been discussed in prior communications. That was not a warning. I asked for the engineer report. She said the HOA had sufficient grounds to act quickly in the interest of public safety. That was not a report either. Every answer she gave was the same answer dressed in different clothes. Pressure without paper. Certainty without proof. She had never come to the creek with documents because she had never planned to win with documents. She planned to win with rubble. Once the bridge was gone, she thought the argument would change from ownership to inconvenience. She thought the neighborhood would see the crossing destroyed, decide the old arrangement was over, and push me into accepting whatever cleaner, newer, more HOA-controlled version of access she wanted next. That was the real plan. Not removal. Replacement. On her terms. I looked past her at the road beyond the creek, then at the broken deck, then at the machine tracks still fresh on the bank, and I realized Melissa had not just damaged a structure. She had tried to reset leverage. She thought if she destroyed the bridge first, the deed would matter less afterward. She was wrong. I walked down the bank slowly and looked at the damage without saying anything for a few seconds. That silence bothered Melissa more than anger would have. People like her know how to fight noise. They know how to turn shouting into instability and make the calmer person look unreasonable just by standing there with the right expression on their face. What they do not know how to handle is someone who studies the scene like a man reading evidence instead of reacting to insult. The bridge was not just torn down. It had been taken apart with purpose. The bolts had been cut clean. The deck boards were shoved off to one side instead of left where they fell. One support post had been pulled with machinery, not broken by weather. Whoever did it had not come out to inspect. They had come out to erase. Melissa mistook my silence for weakness and stepped closer. She said the HOA had given me every chance to cooperate. She said the old bridge had become a liability and that the board had acted before someone got hurt. She said if I had been willing to work with the community, none of this would have been necessary. Necessary. That word stuck in my head. Not because it was smart. Because it told me she still thought this was about convenience. A better bridge. A different crossing. A cleaner arrangement that pushed me off the middle of something the neighborhood relied on. She thought necessity belonged to the people using the road. But necessity is a dangerous thing to misunderstand when the road itself does not belong to you. I asked her one question. Who told you this bridge was yours to remove? She said the community had standing because the neighborhood depended on the crossing every day. There it was. Not ownership. Dependence. Not title. Use. She was still arguing from habit, not law. The two crewmen kept quiet behind her. One of them shifted his boots in the mud and finally looked at me. That look told me enough. He did not know who owned the bridge. He only knew he had been told the HOA wanted it down and had arrived assuming the people giving orders had already checked the paper before sending equipment to a private creek crossing. They had not. Melissa kept talking, faster now, about replacement options, safer access, board oversight, future community planning. Future planning. That was the phrase that explained everything. She had not torn down my bridge to solve a danger. She had torn it down to create an opening. And standing there with the broken rails in the water and the only road to her neighborhood stretching back through land records she had clearly never read, I understood she had made the worst kind of mistake. She thought destruction had simplified the problem. It had only exposed who never knew what they were controlling in the first place. I asked the crewmen to stop touching anything. They did. Not because Melissa told them to. Because by then even they could feel the ground changing under the job. A man can show up with a machine and a work order and still sense when the person giving orders may not have had the right to give them. That feeling was all over both of them now. One stepped back from the bank. The other looked at the broken support beam in the creek like he wished it had never left the bridge in the first place. Melissa hated that shift. You could see it in the way her voice sharpened again. She said the HOA had already made its decision. She said the bridge was coming down whether I liked it or not. She said delaying the process now would only make things more expensive for everyone involved. Expensive. That word almost made me smile. Because she still thought cost was something that came later, after the argument, after the replacement plan. After she had successfully turned my bridge into a neighborhood project under board control. She had no idea the most expensive part of the morning had already happened. The removal itself. I walked back up from the creek bank, opened the truck door, and pulled out the folder I kept behind the seat. Not a dramatic folder. Just paper. Road parcel map. Deed copy. Survey line. Old maintenance notes. The easement language tied to access. The kind of paper most people never bother to read because they assume daily use means the law must already agree with them. Melissa saw the folder and rolled her eyes, which told me she still thought paperwork was a delay tactic instead of the thing that was about to decide who had really crossed the line. I handed the road parcel map to the older of the two crewmen first. Then the deed. He looked at the track description, then at the line running across the creek crossing, then back at me. This road is yours, he asked. Yes. Melissa jumped in immediately and said the neighborhood had long-standing access rights. I nodded once. Use rights, I said. Not ownership. That landed. Because it finally separated the two things she had been trying to blur for months. The neighborhood could depend on the road. They could cross the bridge. They could even have a legal access right through it. None of that meant the HOA owned the bridge, the road, or the ground under either one. Melissa opened her mouth to push back, but the crewman was already studying the survey overlay now, following the line with one dirty finger while the morning quiet settled around all of us. And for the first time since I arrived, nobody at that creek looked like they were standing on HOA property anymore. Melissa recovered the only way she knew how. She started talking faster. That was always her reflex when facts began narrowing the space around her. If she could keep enough words in the air, maybe nobody would notice which ones were missing. Ownership. Deed. Parcel. Authority. She kept reaching instead for softer phrases. Community reliance. Long-standing access. Public safety. Future review. She was trying to stretch use rights until they sounded big enough to cover destruction. They weren't. The older crewman handed the deed back to me more carefully than before. That small movement said a lot. 10 minutes earlier, he was standing beside a machine helping remove a bridge because the HOA said it had to go. Now he was treating the paperwork like something that could get his whole morning pulled into a courtroom if he touched the wrong board again. Melissa saw that too, and it made her sharper. She said the HOA had every right to replace unsafe infrastructure serving the neighborhood. She said the bridge had become a hazard and the board could not just wait around for my permission while residents risked injury. Then she pointed toward the road beyond the creek, as if the line of houses behind the trees could somehow vote the deed out of existence. I asked her the question she had been dodging since I arrived. Where is the document that gives your board the right to alter my bridge? She did not answer directly. She said access rights implied maintenance authority where public use was involved. That was the moment I knew she had fully confused convenience with control. Because easement use is not ownership. Dependence is not ownership. Even necessity is not ownership. And the road behind her neighborhood, the one every resident took for granted every morning, did not belong to the HOA just because their tires crossed it more often than mine. One of the crewmen finally spoke. Quietly. He asked Melissa whether the board had shown them anything proving the crossing itself was HOA property before ordering the teardown. She turned on him fast and said the board did not need to litigate every maintenance decision in the dirt. That answer hurt her more than silence would have. Because the second she said it, the whole job changed shape. This was not an emergency repair. This was not a documented safety response. This was an HOA president who had sent men and machinery to rip apart a privately owned bridge first and sort out the paper later. I looked past her at the broken span in the creek, then farther up toward the paved stretch that fed the whole neighborhood. And I could already see where the real panic would begin once she understood what tearing down my bridge actually meant for the only road they had. Melissa still thought the worst part of the morning was the bridge lying in the creek. It wasn't. The worst part was what the missing bridge exposed. I could see the realization starting at the edges of her expression, but not fully landing yet. She was still focused on the structure itself. Boards. Railings. Safety language. Replacement plans. She kept talking like the answer to everything was a newer crossing under HOA supervision. As if this were some neat little improvement dispute and not a private access problem she had just detonated with rented machinery. So I pointed past her. Not at the water. At the road. It ran up from the creek crossing, curved through the trees, and disappeared toward the subdivision entrance exactly the way it always had. Clean gravel first, then pavement farther up where the neighborhood picked it up and pretended years of daily use had somehow turned it into theirs. I asked her one simple question. If this bridge is gone, how exactly do you think your neighborhood gets through here? That was the first time she did not answer immediately. Her eye shifted toward the road, then back to the torn span, then past me to the folder in my hand like maybe one of those pages was about to say something she did not want said out loud. One of the crewmen understood before she did. I could tell by the way he looked from the broken support posts to the road grade beyond the creek, then back at Melissa with that slow, miserable expression men get when a job stops being inconvenient and becomes stupid in a way no invoice can hide. He asked whether there was another access route. Melissa said the board was reviewing future options. Future options. That was not an answer either. Because there was no second road. No backup entrance. No alternate crossing. No hidden county lane around the ridge. The bridge she had just torn apart was tied to the only practical road the whole neighborhood relied on. And the reason nobody had bothered to think too hard about that before was the same reason people stop questioning a lot of bad arrangements over time. Routine makes borrowed things feel owned. The younger crewman finally looked toward the houses and muttered, almost to himself, so they all come through here. Yes, I said. That one word changed the air. Because now the damage was no longer abstract. No longer legal in a distant, paperwork kind of way. Now it had mornings in it. School drop-offs. Deliveries. Emergency vehicles. Contractors. Residents heading to work before sunrise, all of them trusting a route the HOA had just treated like decorative infrastructure instead of what it really was. The only road home. Melissa heard it. You could see the exact second the phrase settled into her. The only road home. Not a trail. Not a convenience. Not some old private crossing the board could tear out in the morning and replace whenever a cleaner design came along. The only road. The one every resident, contractor, school bus, delivery van, an emergency vehicle depended on without thinking too hard about why it had always been there or whose name sat under the gravel in county records. That was the part people like Melissa never understand until it is too late. Use creates comfort. Comfort creates assumption. An assumption, left alone long enough, starts dressing itself up as authority. She looked back toward the paved rise leading into the neighborhood, and for the first time since I got to the creek, her face stopped looking angry and started looking uncertain. Not because she suddenly respected the deed. Because she had finally reached the part of the mistake that touched her own people. The bridge in the water was no longer just my bridge. It was now their access problem too. She tried to recover. She said the HOA would arrange a temporary solution. She said the board could coordinate alternate routing if necessary. She said the community had handled infrastructure adjustments before and this would be no different. The crewman did not even pretend to believe her. One of them asked where the alternate route would be. She did not answer. The other asked whether emergency services had been told the crossing was being removed. Again, nothing. That silence did more damage than anything else she had said all morning. Because now even the men she hired could hear the shape of the truth. This had not been a planned infrastructure transition. No reroute. No emergency notice. No replacement standing by. Just an HOA president so obsessed with controlling a bridge she never owned that she forgot to ask what stood behind it. A whole neighborhood. I looked past the broken span at the road grade and imagined the first resident coming down later that day expecting normal life on the other side of the trees. Tires rolling forward. Coffee in a cup holder. No idea the HOA had just used their routine like cover for a property grab and, in the process, cut through the one crossing holding that routine together. Melissa's voice got quieter then. She asked what I intended to do. That was the first honest question she had asked all morning. Not what the board wanted. Not what the community expected. Not what authority she imagined she had. What I intended to do. And standing there above the ruined bridge with the creek moving under broken boards and the only road to her neighborhood waiting behind her like a truth she had finally been forced to look at. I realized the power had already flipped before I answered a word. I told Melissa I intended to do exactly what the deed allowed me to do. Nothing more. Nothing less. That answer bothered her more than a threat would have. Because threats can still be negotiated with. They can be softened, redirected, reframed in a board meeting until everyone goes home pretending the real problem was just emotion. A man calmly enforcing what the papers already say is much harder to move. Especially when the bridge is already in pieces and the only road into your neighborhood is sitting behind a mistake you ordered yourself. She asked if I was really going to leave the community stranded over a technical ownership issue. Technical. That word almost made me laugh. Because there was nothing technical about 30 families trying to get home through a crossing she had just destroyed with no replacement, no reroute. And no legal right to touch it in the first place. There was nothing technical about emergency access, school traffic, deliveries, county service vehicles. And every ordinary piece of neighborhood life depending on a road the HOA had gotten too comfortable borrowing. I told her the community was not stranded because of me. It was stranded because she tore down a privately owned bridge without checking who owned the road attached to it. That landed. Not because she agreed. Because the crewmen heard it too. And once workers hear the problem stated plainly, the job starts changing shape in their heads. This was no longer an HOA improvement. No longer some urgent safety removal backed by proper planning and clean authority. Now it was exactly what it looked like. An authorized destruction sitting in a creek with the neighborhood's only practical access waiting behind it. One of the crewmen asked if he should call his supervisor. Yes, I said. Melissa opened her mouth to stop him, but he was already walking toward the truck. That was another turn of the knife for her. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was procedural. She had spent the whole morning acting like procedure belonged to her. Now the first real procedures entering the scene were not hers at all. Supervisor calls. Documentation. Questions about ownership. Questions about access. Questions every honest job should have asked before the first bolt was cut. Melissa tried one last piece of board language. She said the HOA could not be expected to know every private claim affecting infrastructure the neighborhood used daily. I looked at the broken span. That's exactly why you don't demolish it first, I said. She had no answer for that. And in the quiet that followed, with the creek sliding under splintered boards and the road behind her suddenly looking less like shared convenience and more like borrowed survival, I could already feel where the next panic would come from. Not from her. From the first resident who reached the crossing and realized the HOA had not just picked a fight with the wrong landowner. It had cut its own way home. The first resident arrived 20 minutes later. That was when the abstract part of Melissa's mistake ended. A silver SUV came down from the neighborhood side too fast for the curve, then braked hard when the driver saw the torn railing, the broken deck, and the machine tracks along the bank. For a second, the woman behind the wheel just sat there staring through the windshield like her brain needed extra time to accept what her eyes were showing it. Then her door opened, and she stepped out with her phone already in her hand. "What happened to the bridge?" Melissa answered before anyone else could. She said the HOA had removed an unsafe structure and that a temporary access solution was being evaluated. That was the line she chose. Temporary access solution. Clean words. Empty center. The kind of phrase meant to sound like control while the actual problem is still lying in the creek in broken pieces. The woman looked past her at the water, then at the road behind me, then back at the gap where the crossing had been. "How am I supposed to get through?" Melissa said the board was working on it. That was when the second car arrived. Then a contractor truck. Then a delivery van. Not a flood. Not yet. Just enough vehicles to turn a bad decision into a visible fact. One by one, they came around the bend expecting routine and found interruption instead. And every new face that stepped out onto the gravel brought the same rhythm with it. Confusion first. Then irritation. Then the harder question. Who did this? Melissa kept trying to answer before the question fully formed. Safety issue. Necessary action. Community review. Future replacement. She was throwing vocabulary at a hole in the road and hoping words could do what lumber used to. They couldn't. Not once the line of waiting vehicles started growing long enough for people to feel the delay in their own morning instead of in some legal theory she could reshape later in an email. One man in a work truck finally asked whether emergency vehicles had been told the crossing was gone. Melissa did not answer. Another resident asked what alternate route the board had set up before removing the bridge. Again, nothing. That silence spread faster than her explanations. Because once real inconvenience arrives, people stop listening to polished language and start measuring competence. And standing there with the only road to her own neighborhood cut open behind her, Melissa no longer looked like an HOA president solving a problem. She looked like the person who had created one big enough for everyone else to drive straight into. The line of vehicles kept growing, and with every engine that idled at the ruined crossing, Melissa lost another piece of the control she thought she still had. That was the part no HOA woman like her ever plans for. You can bluff one homeowner. You can pressure one family. You can even dress up destruction in policy language if the damage stays far enough away from everyone else's morning. But once ordinary people are forced to sit in their cars and stare at the result, the lie gets shorter fast. A man in a delivery van climbed down from his seat and looked from the broken bridge to the road behind me, then back at Melissa. "So this is the only way through?" he asked. No one answered immediately. That silence did more harm to her than any accusation could have. Because by then, everybody standing there understood the same thing at once. The HOA had not removed a nuisance. It had crippled access. School drop-off parents were now checking the time on their dashboards. A contractor farther back was already on his phone explaining to someone that he was stuck behind a neighborhood with no crossing. The woman in the silver SUV looked less angry now and more worried, which is always worse. Angry people still argue. Worried people start imagining ambulances, fire trucks, medications, children, and all the things that depend on a road working when nobody notices it. Melissa tried again. She said the board had acted on serious safety concerns and that the old bridge could not remain in service. The resident in the SUV pointed at the creek. Then where's the replacement? That question landed hard. Not because it was complicated. Because it was simple enough that everyone there should have asked it before the first bolt was cut. Where's the replacement? Where's the detour? Where's the warning? Where's the plan? Melissa had none of it. And that was the moment the crowd stopped feeling like a group of inconvenienced residents and started feeling like witnesses. One of the crewmen finally returned from his truck and said his supervisor wanted the job paused immediately until ownership and access liability were clarified. He said it loudly enough for everyone to hear. That mattered too. Because once the workers themselves start stepping back, the story changes. The people with tools no longer look like they are fixing something. They look like they are trying to get away from it. Melissa turned on him and said the board had already decided. He shook his head once and said, "Your board doesn't own this creek." That was the first sentence all morning that made the whole crowd go completely still. The stillness after that sentence felt heavier than the creek. Not because anyone suddenly understood easement law in detail. Most of them probably did not. They did not need to. All they needed was that one clean fact landing in public air at the exact wrong moment for Melissa. The board did not own the creek. Which meant the board did not own the bridge footprint. Which meant the board had sent workers to tear apart something it never had clear title to control, while the only road into the neighborhood backed up behind the damage like a line of witnesses. Melissa tried to answer too quickly. She said ownership was not the point. The point was safety, liability, and the HOA's obligation to protect residents from dangerous infrastructure. That might have sounded stronger an hour earlier, before the waiting vehicles, before the questions. Before the missing replacement route made every word out of her mouth sound less like leadership and more like panic dressed in bored language. The woman from the silver SUV looked at me then. Not at Melissa. At me. And asked, "Did you own the bridge?" I told her I owned the road parcel, the crossing sat on my land. And the neighborhood's right to use that route was not the same thing as the HOA's right to destroy it. That changed the crowd again. Because now the problem had shape. This was no longer an ugly little maintenance mistake. It was an HOA president who had confused use with control so badly that she tore down the one crossing her own residents depended on. A contractor farther back muttered something under his breath. The delivery driver just shook his head. One of the parents in the waiting line got back into her car and made a call, and I could already guess who it was to. School. Melissa heard the mood turn and made the same mistake she always made when a room stopped cooperating. She pushed harder. She said the board had long treated the crossing as community infrastructure and that no private owner should be allowed to hold neighborhood access hostage over technical title issues. Hostage. That word hit the crowd badly. Because nobody standing there had watched me destroy a bridge. Nobody had watched me block a road. They were looking at the wreckage Melissa ordered, the machine she brought, the workers she directed, and the absence of any plan beyond the destruction itself. One of the older residents near the front of the line finally said what everyone had started thinking. "So you tore it down first and figured out who owned it later?" Melissa opened her mouth, but nothing came out fast enough to save her. That was the moment the whole scene finally turned against her. Not in some loud, dramatic way. No shouting. No crowd rushing forward. Just the slow, brutal shift that happens when ordinary people stop wondering who is right and start realizing exactly who made the mess in front of them. The broken bridge was still in the creek. The road was still blocked. Cars were still lined up behind the crossing. And now, for the first time all morning, the residents were no longer listening to Melissa's explanations as if they might contain a solution. They were listening to them as evidence. She tried to say the board acted in the community's best interest. The older resident cut her off. "Before or after you checked who owned it?" That landed harder than anything else. Because it was the right question. Simple enough for everyone there to understand. Sharp enough that no polished HOA language could slide around it. Melissa stood there in her pressed clothes with machine tracks on the bank behind her and a line of trapped residents in front of her, and for the first time since I reached the creek. She looked like someone who had finally realized the bored voice was not going to carry her through this one. One of the parents near the front stepped out of her SUV and said she had to get her daughter to school. The delivery driver said he was already late on 2 stops. The contractor farther back asked whether any emergency vehicle had even been told the crossing was gone. Every question came from a different direction, but they all pressed on the same point. Where was the plan? Melissa had none. That was what broke her. Not the deed. Not the creek. Not even the bridge itself. The absence of a plan. Because once people understand you destroyed something before thinking through what came next, your authority starts shrinking right in front of them. She kept trying to talk about future options, temporary solutions, board review, but every sentence sounded weaker than the one before it. The residents were no longer hearing leadership in her voice. They were hearing cleanup. The crewman who had called his supervisor stepped farther away from the bank and said no one on his side was touching another board until ownership and liability were confirmed in writing. That mattered too. The workers were out now. No machine. No fast rebuild. No quiet fix that could be slapped together before lunch so the story stayed small. The crossing was gone. The neighborhood was waiting. And Melissa, who thought tearing down my bridge would finally put the road under HOA control, was now standing in front of her own residence looking like the one person who never understood what that bridge was actually holding up. Melissa tried one last time to sound like the person in charge. That was almost painful to watch. Not because she lacked words. Melissa always had words. She had built half her influence on choosing phrases that sounded responsible while hiding the damage underneath them. Community protection. Board obligation. Safety review. Emergency action. But those phrases only work while people still believe there was thought behind them. Standing there beside a destroyed bridge, with residents trapped on one side and the only road home hanging open over the creek, she no longer sounded responsible. She sounded cornered. She said the board would arrange emergency contractors. The crewman nearest the bank shook his head and said no one on his side was rebuilding a structure tied to disputed ownership without written direction, legal clearance, and a liability release. That made the crowd even quieter. Because now the residents were hearing the same thing from every angle. The bridge was not coming back in the next hour. Not by confidence. Not by HOA vote. Not by Melissa snapping her fingers and calling it a fix. She had broken something she did not own, on land she did not control, along the only route her neighborhood relied on. And now even the people with the machines wanted distance from her name before they touched another board. One of the residents finally asked me what the road records actually said. I told him the truth. The road parcel belonged to me. The crossing sat on my land. The neighborhood had use, not ownership. That distinction had never mattered to Melissa because routine had made the borrowed thing feel permanent. But the law notices those differences even when neighborhoods stop seeing them. A man farther back in line muttered, "So she tore down your bridge and stranded us on your road." No one corrected him. Not even Melissa. That was the moment her authority truly left her. Not when I showed the papers. Not when the workers stepped back. Not even when the first resident started turning angry. It left when she stopped being the woman explaining what would happen next and became the woman everyone else was now explaining the problem through. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen and answered too fast. I could hear only pieces, but I heard enough. A board member. Tense voice. Questions. Not support. Not reassurance. Questions. She turned away while talking, but that only made it worse. Because now the residents could watch the exact second the HOA itself stopped sounding like her shield and started sounding like one more audience demanding to know why she had destroyed the one crossing no one else in that neighborhood had ever bothered to understand until she tore it apart. By the time Melissa ended that call, she was no longer standing at the creek like an HOA president. She was standing there like the person who had just given the whole neighborhood one shared problem and no clean way around it. That was the thing about power in places like that. It looks permanent right up until reality forces everybody to ask one simple question. Who actually owns what? For months, maybe years, Melissa had been living on the opposite question. Who uses it? Who depends on it? Who complains loudest if it changes? That way of thinking had worked for her long enough that she stopped noticing the difference between convenience and control. The residents used the road, so she treated it like theirs. The neighborhood crossed the bridge, so she treated it like board property. Enough people relied on something, and in her mind the HOA inherited the right to manage it. Then she tore it down. And in one morning, the whole illusion cracked open. The residents could see it now. Not in theory. In traffic. In school schedules. In delivery delays. In the sight of the only crossing lying smashed in the creek while the woman who ordered it stood there with no replacement, no reroute, no paperwork. And no answer that made the waiting vehicles behind her look any less trapped. That was the part Melissa never planned for. Not me. Them. She had expected a property fight with one stubborn landowner. Something she could frame as selfishness or resistance to progress. What she got instead was a line of her own residents looking at the wreckage and realizing the board president had destroyed something critical before checking whether it even belonged to the HOA in the first place. And once people see that clearly, trust starts dying fast. One resident drove off to call the school. Another started filming the creek. The delivery driver was already on his phone telling someone he could not get through because the HOA tore out the damn bridge. That sentence stayed with me. Because it was ugly. And accurate. Melissa thought she tore down an old structure. What she really tore down was her own believability. I stood there above the water with the road papers still in my hand, the broken span below us, and the neighborhood stacked up on the wrong side of a mistake she made with total confidence. And the more I looked at the scene, the clearer the truth became. They didn't tear down my bridge and leave me stranded. They tore down my bridge and stranded themselves on my road.